At 4:17, the snow began to move. At 4:17 in the morning, on January 14, 1943, somewhere along a frozen sector of the Eastern Front west of Rzeów, Oberleutnant Karl Weiss leaned forward inside the turret of his Panzer III and watched the white field ahead through glass clouded at the edges with frost. Verify. The engine beneath him had been running for nearly 20 minutes, coughing, settling, then rising again into a low metallic growl. It filled the cramped fighting compartment with vibration. Diesel fumes and burned oil hung in the cold air. The floor plates were slick with melted snow from the crew's boots. Somewhere behind him, another tank ground its gears too sharply, and the sound carried through the dark like a chain being dragged over stone. Weiss checked his watch again. 4:17. The hands were small, pale, almost ridiculous in the half-light. Ahead of him there was nothing. No muzzle flash. No Soviet infantry moving between the trees. No anti-tank gun revealing itself with that hard, flat crack German crews had learned to fear. Only snow. A flat stretch of it, wind-scoured in places, soft and heaped in others, broken by a few black shrubs and the faint shadow of a track that may have been made by a cart, or a patrol, or nothing at all. The map on the battalion table had shown this field as passable ground. Unpleasant ground. Frozen ground. But passable. The order had been simple enough. Move before dawn. Cross the open ground. Reach the low ridge. Break into the Soviet forward line before their artillery could settle. Speed mattered. Surprise mattered. And in German armored war, movement had always meant life. Inside the tank, no one spoke much. The driver had both gloved hands tight on the levers. The radio operator kept one ear pressed to the headset, hearing bursts of static, short commands, half-words from vehicles he could not see. The gunner breathed slowly through his nose, trying not to fog the sight. The loader sat with one knee against a shell rack, eyes half closed, not sleeping, not awake either. Then the lead vehicle rolled forward. The tracks crushed the first crust of snow with a sound like breaking glass. 10 meters. 20. 30. Weiss saw its dark shape slide across the field, slow at first, then gaining confidence. The commander of that tank kept his hatch half open. That was the habit in poor visibility. A man saw more with his eyes than through steel slits. He also died faster that way. Everyone knew both truths. The tank reached a shallow depression. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the ground lifted. The explosion did not look large at first. Not like artillery. Not like a direct hit. It was lower, more intimate, almost buried inside the earth. A burst of white snow, black soil, and torn metal came up beneath the left track. The tank lurched sideways, stopped, and rocked once on its suspension as if something beneath it had grabbed hold. No flame. No cinematic blast. Just a stop tank. Then the radio came alive. Mine. A pause. Lead vehicle disabled. Another voice cut across it, sharper. Keep moving. Bypass left. The second tank turned. It moved 3 vehicle lengths around the first. Its driver tried to avoid the churned snow and the hanging track links of the disabled machine. For a moment it looked as if the answer had been found. There was space. There was always space somewhere. Then the second explosion came. This time Weiss saw the track fly loose. It whipped out from under the hull like a torn belt. The tank slid, and settled nose first into the snow. Now the field was no longer empty. It had become a question. Every untouched patch of white was suddenly suspicious. Every shallow rise became a possible trigger. Every rut looked deliberate. The men who had been cold a moment earlier began to sweat beneath their wool and leather. Still no Soviet gun had fired. That was the part that unsettled Weiss. The enemy was not visible. The field itself had struck first. German crews had been trained to recognize danger in many forms. Muzzle smoke, moving infantry, the flash of optics, the shape of an anti-tank gun behind brush, the sudden silence before artillery. But this was different. There was no man to shoot back at, no target to suppress, no sound except engines idling, radios cracking, and the thin winter wind moving over the snow. The battalion commander ordered the column to halt. Then, almost immediately, he ordered it to move. Those two commands fought each other inside every tank. Halt meant survive. Move meant obey. For the men in the vehicles, the difference was not theoretical. A tank stopped in the open was armor without motion. A target waiting for someone else's calculation. A few hundred meters away, in a Soviet trench cut into frozen earth, a sapper named Mikhail Sokolov may have been watching the same field through a slit between two snow-covered logs. Verify his face would have been raw from the cold. His hands, even inside mittens, would have remembered the shape of the mines he had buried the night before. He would have known which patches of snow had been disturbed and brushed smooth. He would have known which gap looked safe because it was meant to look safe. He might not have called it strategy. He might have called it work. The Germans believed they had met an obstacle. What really happened was colder than that. They had driven into a weapon that did not move, did not speak, and did not need courage at the moment of contact. The courage had been spent earlier, in darkness, by men crawling on their stomachs through frozen soil while German flares burned overhead. And now, at 4:19, with two tanks disabled and the rest of the column waiting, the first Soviet artillery observer lifted his field telephone and began to speak. The mines had not finished the attack. They had only stopped it long enough for the rest of the battlefield to wake up. The German faith in steel and speed. To understand why the minefield surprised them, you have to understand what German armored warfare had taught its own men to believe. A tank was not simply a vehicle. It was a promise that firepower could move, that armor could cross open ground where infantry would be cut down, that a commander with radios, maps, and nerve could push through weakness before the enemy understood what had happened. In the early years of the war, German armored formations had turned that promise into something terrifying. Roads collapsed under columns of half-tracks and tanks. Headquarters vanished behind advancing spearheads. Lines on maps stopped being lines and became arrows. For men trained in that tradition, speed was not decoration. It was doctrine. A slow attack allowed the enemy to think. A halted attack allowed the enemy to aim. The battlefield was supposed to be forced open by pressure, coordination, and tempo. Tanks moved first. Infantry followed. Engineers cleared what had to be cleared. Artillery suppressed what had to be suppressed. Radios tied the pieces together, at least in theory. And if a Soviet position seemed too strong, the answer was usually to shift, flank, penetrate, and keep the enemy off balance. Mines did not fit neatly into that imagination. They were passive. They waited. They had no engine, no turret, no commander leaning over a map with a grease pencil. They did not choose targets. They did not adjust for wind. They did not pursue. They were, to many soldiers, a dirty weapon of denial. Something left behind by troops who could not stop tanks directly. German engineers respected mines more than many tank officers did. They had to. They were the men ordered to clear them. They knew the patience required to find a buried pressure plate under ice, the danger of a second device placed near the first, the cruelty of mines protected by other mines. But at higher levels, especially in planning rooms where maps were dry and coffee was hot, minefields often became symbols. Obstacles, delays, problems assigned to specialists. A mine belt could be marked. A lane could be opened. Pioneer team could be sent forward. A tank with a damaged track could be recovered later. That was the belief. And it was not foolish in every circumstance. German formations had crossed minefields before. They had engineers with training and tools. They had vehicles designed to tow, bridge, pull, and repair. They had commanders who knew that fear of mines could paralyze an advance more completely than mines themselves. A unit that stopped at every rumor of explosives would never move at all. So the German answer often was pressure. Do not let the obstacle become the battle. Find the edge. Force a lane. Keep moving. But the Eastern Front did not always reward the habits that had worked elsewhere. The ground was too large. The weather too cruel. The Soviet defenses too deep and too willing to trade space for time. A road that looked clear at midnight could be covered by artillery at dawn. A field that scouts had crossed on foot could collapse under the weight of a tank. Snow could hide not only mines, but the evidence that anyone had placed them there. Frozen ground preserved track marks. Then wind erased them. A shallow drift could conceal a wooden mine that a detector might not notice easily. A disabled vehicle could block a narrow forest path and force an entire company into open terrain. On paper, a minefield was an engineering problem. In the snow, under fire, with radios failing and officers shouting for movement, it became something else. A German tank commander did not have the luxury of solving the whole problem. He had seconds, sometimes less. He saw a stopped tank ahead. He saw a gap to the left. He saw smoke beginning to rise from the engine deck. He heard the battalion net demanding progress. He knew that to remain still was dangerous. He also knew that to move might be worse. That was how confidence began to crack. Not all at once. Not with panic at first. With hesitation. A driver easing off the throttle. A commander leaving his hatch open longer than he should. A radio operator asking for confirmation and receiving only static. A gunner waiting for a target that never appeared because the weapon that had stopped them was under the ground. The Germans believed steel and speed could break through passive defenses. But Soviet mine warfare attacked the relationship between steel and speed. It turned the power of a tank against the weight of the tank itself. It made movement uncertain. It made certainty expensive. And for an army trained to seize initiative, few things were more dangerous than being forced to ask the ground for permission. The field west of Rzeszów was not unique. Across the Eastern Front, German units encountered more and more defensive systems that did not behave like simple obstacles. Mines were placed not only to destroy but to guide. Not only to block but to deceive. Not only in belts, but in patterns tied to artillery, anti-tank guns, infantry positions, ravines, roads, villages, frozen streams, and tree lines. The German map might show open ground. The Soviet engineer saw a corridor. The German commander saw a field. The Soviet sapper saw a machine, assembled from snow, explosives, gun crews, wire, and time. And the most dangerous part of that machine was not yet visible. Because once the first tank stopped, the German attack had to make a choice. Clear the mines slowly and lose the morning. Bypass quickly and risk more explosions. Or push forward and hope the field had already spent its teeth. None of those choices belonged entirely to the Germans anymore. That was the first defeat the minefield inflicted. Before it destroyed a tank, it took away the clean decision. The Soviet engineers no one filmed. The cameras loved tanks. They loved the long barrel of a gun catching winter light. They loved the silhouettes of men riding on armor, faces wrapped in scarves, rifles across their knees. They loved smoke, movement, wreckage, flags, ruined cities, and the hard geometry of machines crossing fields that had once grown rye or potatoes. They rarely loved the men with shovels. Soviet sappers did not look like the center of a war story. They carried mines in wooden crates, coils of wire, probes, axes, detonators, and tools with handles worn smooth by hands that were never fully warm. Their uniforms were often torn the same way infantry uniforms were torn. Their boots leaked. Their faces were blackened by smoke and frost. They worked at night because daylight belonged to artillery and snipers. Their battlefield was inches deep. A tank commander looked across a field and thought in hundreds of meters. A sapper looked down and thought in finger widths. Where was the soil frozen hardest? Where would snow drift naturally after the wind shifted? Which rut would a German driver trust? Which patch of ground looked too obvious and would be avoided? Which gap would appear accidental? How close could a mine be placed to another without one blast ruining the pattern? Where should anti-personnel mines be hidden to punish the men sent to clear the anti-tank mines? This was not glamorous work. It was slow work. And slow work near the enemy was a kind of terror all its own. Imagine a Soviet sapper lying flat in the snow at 2 in the morning. His breath pressed into the wool around his mouth. His fingers numb enough that he has to look at them to know if they are still holding the tool. Somewhere ahead, German flares rise and fall. For a moment the whole field turns white-blue, every shadow sharpening, every man becoming visible if he moves at the wrong time. No one breathes loudly. No one coughs if he can help it. The mine in his hands is not heavy in the way a shell is heavy. It is worse than that. It is intimate. It is close enough to feel personal. A mistake does not fly away toward the enemy. It stays with him. It waits under his palms. He scrapes at the frozen ground. Too loud. He stops. The wind covers him. He scrapes again. Behind him, another man smooths snow over a mine already placed. Not too perfect. Perfect snow is suspicious. The surface must look careless, wind-touched, ordinary. The work requires imagination. That is what the Germans sometimes missed. Soviet minefields were not merely accumulations of explosives. They were predictions. Someone had to imagine the German attack before it happened. Someone had to picture the lead tank, the turn, the hesitation, the bypass, the recovery team, the officer furious on the radio, the infantry bunching behind armor, the second vehicle trying to go around the first. The minefield was laid in the future tense. This is where he will drive. This is where he will swerve. This is where he will stop. This is where our guns will find him. Soviet engineers had learned from catastrophe. In 1941, German armored forces had cut through Soviet armies with terrifying speed. Whole formations were outmaneuvered, encircled, shattered. The Red Army paid for those lessons in numbers almost impossible to hold in the mind. But armies that survive disaster sometimes become very serious students. They learn what theory did not teach quickly enough. By 1942 and 1943, Soviet defensive thinking had hardened. Depth mattered. Redundancy mattered. Anti-tank guns alone were not enough. Tanks alone were not enough. Mines alone were not enough. But together, layered carefully, they could slow, break, and bleed an armored attack before it reached the position it was meant to crush. The sapper was not outside that system. He was one of its first authors. And yet, in many accounts, he disappears behind phrases like, mine obstacles were prepared, or engineer units strengthened the defensive belt. A sentence. Sometimes less. No mention of the man who carried the mine. No mention of the one who froze his hands fixing a detonator. No mention of the junior officer who chose to leave one lane open because he knew a German commander would take the offer. This is where the Warfront Archive question begins to matter. What did they believe? Many German soldiers believed Soviet mines were signs of crude defense, desperation, or lack of tactical finesse. What really happened? The mines were being placed by men who understood German habits well enough to weaponize them. They did not need to defeat German doctrine in a classroom. They only needed to interrupt it in a field. And there is a quiet cruelty in that kind of intelligence. It does not announce itself. It does not win medals in front of cameras. It waits until the enemy believes he has found a way through. Then it closes the ground under him. By the time German tanks began moving at 417, the Soviet sappers had already left. Their footprints had been brushed over. Their tools packed away. Their hands wrapped around tin cups of tea or rifle stocks or nothing at all. The field looked natural again. That was the achievement. Not the explosion. The invisibility. Because the most effective trap is not the one that looks deadly. It is the one that looks like a road. And somewhere in that white silence, a German driver was about to choose exactly the path a tired Soviet engineer had imagined hours before. Stop the tank, don't kill it. A tank destroyed in flames is easy to understand. A tank stopped in silence is more complicated. The German crews knew how to count losses. A vehicle burned out. A turret blown open. A gun penetrated. An engine compartment on fire. Those were clear outcomes. Men could point to them. Reports could list them. Commanders could say how many vehicles were lost, how many recovered, how many temporarily disabled. But Soviet mine warfare lived in the gray space between alive and dead. A mine did not always need to kill the crew. It did not always need to ignite ammunition. It did not always need to punch through the belly armor or tear the hull apart. Sometimes the entire purpose was to break a track. That sounds small until you imagine the battlefield from inside the formation. The lead tank stops, not because it has chosen to stop, but because one side can no longer move. The driver tries the controls. The engine revs. The hull twists slightly. The broken track grinds uselessly under the road wheels. The commander looks back. Behind him, the second tank is too close. Behind that, the third and fourth are already slowing. Infantry following behind begin to bunch up because men naturally gather behind steel when the world becomes dangerous. Now the column has a problem. Not a heroic problem. A mechanical one. The most humiliating kind in war. A vehicle weighing many tons is blocking the route. If the road is narrow, it must be pulled aside. If the field is mined, no one knows where to drive around it. If the enemy is watching, every minute adds danger. If recovery equipment is brought forward, that equipment may become the next target. If engineers crawl out to inspect the track, they are men on snow under enemy observation. The mine has done its work. The tank is still there, but the attack has lost its shape. This was the Soviet insight, not always written dramatically, not always understood by those far from the front. But at the level of mud, steel, and breathing men, it mattered more than slogans. A mobility kill could be enough. One broken track could turn an armored vehicle from a weapon into a barricade. One barricade could turn a lane into a funnel. One funnel could turn a moving formation into a row of targets. And once the formation stopped, other Soviet weapons entered the conversation. An anti-tank gun that might have had only a few seconds to fire at a moving target now had a stationary silhouette. Artillery that might have been chasing a fast attack now had a grid square. Infantry that might have been overrun now had time to aim. Commanders in field bunkers could receive reports, adjust reserves, and decide where the true German effort was falling. Time was the hidden currency. The Germans often thought in terms of penetration. Could the line be broken? Could the ridge be taken? Could the village be seized before Soviet reserves arrived? The Soviet minefield answered with another question. How many minutes can we steal? 5 minutes might be enough for an anti-tank gun crew to shift. 10 minutes might let artillery correct. 20 minutes might ruin the synchronization between tanks and infantry. An hour could turn a planned breakthrough into a stalled attack under observation. The mine did not have to win the battle. It only had to delay the moment when the Germans expected to win it. This is why mockery was dangerous. To call a weapon primitive is sometimes to misunderstand the job it performs. A shovel is primitive. A trench is primitive. Barbed wire is primitive. Mud is primitive. Winter is primitive. But no serious soldier survives long by laughing at things that stop movement. The Soviets did not need every minefield to be perfect. In fact, no minefield in war is perfect. Some mines fail. Some are misplaced. Some are discovered. Some are bypassed. Some kill men long after the battle, when no tactical purpose remains and only tragedy is left. Mine warfare is brutal in part because it does not always know when the war is over. But during the fighting, in those hours when a German attack pressed toward a Soviet line, the minefield did not need perfection. It needed uncertainty. If German crews knew exactly where the mines were, they could adapt. If they knew there were no mines, they could move. But if they suspected mines, if the first tank had vanished into smoke, if the second had lost a track trying to bypass, if engineers had been hit while clearing a lane, then every decision slowed. That was the deeper damage. The driver no longer drove with full confidence. The commander no longer read the terrain as open. The battalion no longer trusted its timetable. The map, which had looked so clean under lamplight, began to lose authority. And war punishes that gap between map and ground. Inside a German command vehicle, an officer might still see arrows. He might still demand forward movement. He might still believe that hesitation was the enemy. But the men at the front saw something else. They saw a white field in which nothing visible had fired, yet tanks had stopped. They saw engineers crawling. They saw artillery beginning to walk toward them. They understood, perhaps before the reports did, that they were no longer fighting only Soviet soldiers. They were fighting a design that treated a tank not as an invincible machine, but as a thing with tracks, weight, habits, blind spots, and commanders under pressure. The Soviets had asked a simple question. What if we do not have to kill the beast? What if we only have to make it kneel? And once the first German tank knelt in the snow, everything behind it began to bend, laying the trap beneath the snow. The night before an attack always has its own sound. Not silence exactly, Silence is too clean a word. There is the muffled scrape of boots, the soft clatter of equipment being handled by tired men trying not to wake the enemy, the low cough of someone who turns his face into his sleeve too late, the distant thud of artillery that may be miles away or may be walking closer, the wind moving loose snow over hard ground. For Soviet sappers, that night was not a pause before battle. It was the battle. They moved forward before the Germans did, often in small groups, often carrying more weight than seemed reasonable for men already exhausted. Mines in crates, stakes, wire, tools, sometimes explosives for obstacles, sometimes markers for friendly lanes, though markers could be lost, buried, misread, or destroyed. A minefield that cannot be understood by your own side is not a defense. It is a future disaster. The work required care under conditions designed to destroy care. Frozen earth does not accept a shovel quietly. A pick striking hard ground can ring in the dark. Snow hides mistakes, but it also hides memory. A man who turns around too many times may lose the pattern of what has already been placed. In the cold, fingers lose delicacy. Metal sticks to skin. Breath freezes on scarves. A detonator handled carelessly can become the last thing a man ever touches. They had to think like engineers. They also had to think like hunters. Where would a German tank commander trust the ground? Not necessarily the shortest route. Not always the road. Roads could be shelled, cratered, blocked. A confident commander might prefer the edge of a field, where trees offered reference points. A cautious one might follow old tracks. A desperate one might drive toward any gap that looked unguarded. So the Soviet pattern could not be merely straight. A straight belt warns the enemy. A clever minefield speaks in half-truths. Here a real mine. There nothing. Beyond it, another mine where a driver might turn after seeing the first explosion. Farther still, a lane left passable not out of mercy, but because that lane points toward a gun. It is easy, decades later, to draw these things on a map and make them look obvious. Blue arrows, red blocks, shaded danger areas. But the men laying the mines did not see the battle from above. They saw darkness close to the ground. They saw their own hands. They saw the shadow of the next man. They saw the vague black outline of a tree line and tried to remember whether the anti-tank gun behind it had been shifted 50 meters left or not. There was no perfection here. Only judgment and pressure. A junior Soviet engineer officer might have had orders to prepare a belt across a likely approach. But the field itself argued with him. Too much snow in one place. Ground too hard in another. Not enough time. Not enough mines. Men missing from the work party because they had been wounded that afternoon. A German patrol too close. A flare at the wrong moment. So he chooses. He places fewer mines in one sector and more in another. He protects the obvious bypass. He marks a lane for Soviet infantry, then worries the mark is too visible. He tells one sapper to smooth the snow again. He tells another not to make it too smooth. He listens for engines that may not yet be there. He knows something the German commander does not. The minefield will not be judged by whether it looks good on a diagram. It will be judged by what happens in the first 2 minutes of contact. If the lead tank stops in the right place, the whole design breathes. If the Germans bypass too easily, the work has failed. If Soviet artillery fires too soon, the Germans may pull back. If it fires too late, the tanks may cross. War often turns on such ugly timing. No speech, no glory, just men in the snow trying to build a few minutes of delay before dawn. By first light, the field had changed and not changed. That was the strange art of it. The surface looked almost untouched. Wind had helped. Darkness had hidden the rest. In places, the snow lay over mines so thinly that a boot might have revealed them. In others, the drift was deep enough to make detection difficult. The safest route was no longer the route that looked safe. The Germans would see open ground. The Soviets had made a decision beneath it. Somewhere behind the line, artillery crews waited beside guns whose barrels had already been laid on likely points. Anti-tank crews checked sights and ammunition. Infantrymen stamped their feet in trenches, trying to keep blood moving. A field telephone line ran back through frozen dirt and snow, delicate as a vein. The minefield alone was not enough. But no part of the system wanted to be alone. That was the point. At dawn, when the German engines began to gather in the distance, the sappers were no longer in the field. Their work had become invisible. Their fear had been buried with the mines. Their choices lay under snow, waiting for another man's weight. The Germans believed they were approaching a Soviet position. What really happened was that they were already inside the outer edge of a Soviet calculation. And the first man to discover that calculation would not be a general or a historian or an officer bending over a map. It would be a driver, feeling the ground disappear under his left track. The first tank vanishes. The first explosion did not end the attack. That is important. Battles rarely break in one dramatic instant. More often, they deform. A plan bends, then bends again, until the men inside it no longer recognize its original shape. The lead German tank sat at an angle in the snow, engine still running, one track broken and twisted beneath the hull. This commander had dropped back inside the turret after the blast. His ears rang. The driver shouted something no one understood. For several seconds, the crew did what trained crews do after shock. They checked themselves. They checked the gun. They checked fire. They checked whether the vehicle could still move. Could not. Behind them, the column compressed. That was the first small disaster. A tank formation needs space the way a lung needs air. Vehicles too close together cannot maneuver. They cannot see properly. They cannot react without colliding, blocking, or exposing one another. But under fire, men close distance instinctively. They want to keep visual contact. They want not to be alone. The second tank tried to bypass. It moved left, slow enough to be careful, fast enough to show obedience. Its driver avoided the churned snow around the lead vehicle. The commander stood higher in the hatch, looking for disturbed ground. The tank's gun traversed slightly, as if the enemy might finally reveal himself. Then the second mine detonated. A smaller blast, less smoke, but enough. The left track came loose. A road wheel shattered. The tank lurched, stopped, and blocked the bypass it had just created. Now the German commander had a field problem, a command problem, and a time problem all at once. Over the radio, reports began to overlap. First vehicle immobilized. Second vehicle hit. Possible mine belt. Need pioneers forward. Artillery. Keep formation. Do not bunch. Easy words. Hard ground. The pioneers were ordered forward. These were not men who misunderstood danger. German combat engineers had seen what mines did to bodies. They knew that a minefield under observation was one of the worst places a soldier could be sent. To clear a lane, they had to leave the relative protection of vehicles or cover and enter the uncertain space ahead. They carried probes, detectors where available, charges, markers, and the knowledge that every movement might be watched. At first, the Soviet line stayed quiet. That quiet was not mercy. It was discipline. A machine gun firing too soon might warn the engineers back. An anti-tank gun revealing itself too early might be suppressed. Artillery called before the column fully halted might waste shells on moving targets. The minefield had forced the Germans to stop. The next weapons had to wait until the stop became congestion. Then the first Soviet shells fell behind the disabled tanks. Not directly on them. Behind them. That mattered. The artillery was not merely trying to hit steel. It was trying to seal the space. To make retreat difficult. To make following vehicles hesitate. To separate tanks from infantry. To make every order sound late the moment it was given. A shell landed near the road. Snow and dirt burst upward. Another struck closer to the infantry following behind the armor. Men dropped flat. Someone shouted for medics. A third shell landed near a pioneer team moving toward the first tank, and the men disappeared for a moment inside smoke and powder snow. Inside Weiss's tank, the radio operator pressed his headset harder against one ear. Forward by sections, a voice ordered. Then static. Then another voice. Mines left. Mines left. A machine gun opened from the tree line. The sound was not loud compared to artillery, but it was more personal. It stitched the open ground around the engineers. Men who had been crawling now flattened themselves into the snow. One raised an arm, perhaps to signal, perhaps because he had been hit. No one inside the tanks could tell. The German guns began firing at suspected positions. Muzzle flashes lit the dark. Shells struck the trees. Branches fell. Snow shook loose in clouds. For a moment, German firepower returned confidence to the scene. Tanks could still shoot. Guns could still answer. Steel still had a voice. But shooting did not clear the ground. That was the difference. A German tank could fire into the tree line all morning and still not know whether the next 5 meters were safe. The minefield had divided the battlefield into two worlds. Above ground, the Germans could fight. Below ground, they had to guess. Soviet anti-tank guns now entered the battle. Not all at once. One fired, then another from a different angle. A round struck the side of the immobilized lead tank and glanced. Another hit lower, near the suspension. A third found the second vehicle already helpless. Whether it penetrated or not mattered less than the fact that the tanks could not maneuver away. The German crews had expected to cross danger. Instead, danger had made them wait. And waiting in armor is a strange form of fear. The vehicle feels strong until it cannot move. Then the same armor that protects you begins to feel like a box someone else has measured. You hear impacts. You smell smoke. You cannot see enough. You know men outside are dying trying to reach you, and you know climbing out may be worse. The Germans had entered the field thinking the mine was the obstacle. What really happened was that the mine was the hand on the shoulder. It made them stop. Then the battlefield turned to face them. By 4:40, less than half an hour after the first explosion, the original plan was already slipping. The ridge ahead remained untaken. The infantry were behind schedule. Engineers had not opened a safe lane. Artillery was falling near the approach. Officers still spoke of momentum, but momentum had become a memory from before the snow erupted. And somewhere in the Soviet line, a sapper who had laid one of those mines might have heard the explosions and known only this: the field had held long enough. But holding was not the same as winning. German commanders were not helpless. They adapted. They had other vehicles, other routes, other guns, other men. If one lane failed, another might be found. If one field was mined, pressure could shift. The Soviet defense had 1 minute. Now it had to turn minutes into destruction. That required the full killing system to reveal itself. The killing system. A minefield by itself is a warning. A minefield tied to guns is a trap. The difference is everything. The Germans had not driven into random explosives scattered by frightened men. They had entered a defensive system built from layers, each one meant to make the next more effective. Mines broke movement. Wires slowed infantry. Anti-tank guns waited for vehicles forced into predictable paths. Artillery covered the likely halts. Machine guns protected the engineer's nightmare. The open ground where men had to crawl if they wanted to clear a lane. This was the part German crews often learned too late. The mine did not have to be the strongest weapon. It only had to make stronger weapons easier to use. A moving tank is difficult to kill. Not impossible, but difficult. Distance changes. Angle changes. Speed forces the gunner to lead. Smoke obscures. Terrain interrupts. Fear shortens decisions. But a stop tank is a different problem. Its range can be measured. Its angle can be studied. Its vulnerable points can be chosen. If it tries to reverse and cannot, the gun crew knows. If the crew bails out, machine guns can cover the hatches. If recovery vehicles come forward, artillery can search the road behind. The Soviets understood this brutally well. Their defensive positions were often not elegant in appearance. Trenches collapsed. Dugouts flooded. Gun pits were cold and cramped. Men slept beside ammunition. Telephone wires broke. Maps became wet, torn, outdated. But the logic could be hard and clear. Do not meet German armor only at the point of contact. Shape the contact before it happens. Force tanks into lanes. Break their rhythm. Separate them from infantry. Make them show their sides. Make them stop under guns already waiting. In a command bunker behind the Soviet forward line, A junior officer might have received reports from observation posts in fragments. First tank stopped. Second stopped left. Infantry behind. Pioneers forward. To a civilian ear, these are details. To a defensive commander, they are openings. Artillery shifts 50 meters. A gun crew is told to hold fire until the third vehicle turns. A machine gun waits for engineers. A reserve anti-tank rifle team moves toward a flank. No one sees the whole battle clearly. That is another truth. We should not imagine Soviet officers as chess masters calmly moving pieces across perfect boards. They were cold, tired, pressured, and often half-informed. Their own men were dying. Their own lines were under threat. Orders arrived late or not at all. But the system did not require perfect vision. It required preparation. Once the Germans slowed, the preparation began to matter more than improvisation. The anti-tank gun crews had been waiting in positions chosen not for comfort, but for angles. A gun hidden near a tree line might have had a narrow field of fire, but that narrow field crossed the very lane German vehicles were likely to use after the first mine. Another gun, farther back, might not fire until the Germans tried to withdraw. Mortars could reach places machine guns could not. Artillery could strike beyond direct sight if observers survived long enough to call corrections. The minefield was the hinge. Before it, German doctrine still had room to move. After it, German choices narrowed. And that narrowing is one of the most terrifying things in combat. Men can endure danger when they believe they have options. When every option seems anticipated, fear changes character. It becomes not panic, but the sense of being read. A German commander orders a bypass. A mine waits there. He orders engineers forward. Machine guns cover the lane. He orders smoke. Artillery shifts. He orders tanks to push through. The field takes another track. It begins to feel less like a defense and more like a conversation in which the enemy has already heard your next sentence. This is where the mockery died. Not in one report, not in one dramatic admission, but in the accumulated experience of crews who realized that Soviet minefields were not simply obstacles placed in front of a line. They were part of a language of defense. And German armored units had to learn that language while under fire. The snow made everything worse. Snow softened outlines, concealed wires. It hid disturbed earth. It reflected flashes in strange ways. It made distance difficult to judge. It muffled movement until explosions seemed to come from nowhere. A mine under mud might be suspected by the texture of the ground. A mine under fresh snow could become part of the landscape. And once vehicles began exploding, the snow itself became evidence and deception at the same time. A black crater showed one mine, but did that mean the area beside it was safe? Or had the Soviets placed another mine exactly where a driver would turn to avoid the crater? A broken tank marked danger, but it also created cover. Was that cover usable? Or had the Soviets expected men to gather there? War reduced to questions like these becomes slow. And slowness was what the minefield wanted. The Germans believed the main contest was armor against armor, gun against gun, formation against formation. What really happened was that the battlefield became a system of forced pauses. A stopped tank made a target. A target drew fire. Fire drew rescuers. Rescuers drew more fire. And every attempt to solve the problem created another problem in the same small patch of snow. That is how tanks vanished. Not always physically. Some remained visible, black shapes against white ground, engines dead or idling, crews trapped or gone. But they vanished from the attack, from the timetable, from the commander's intention, from the momentum that had given them meaning. A tank that cannot move is still steel. But war does not reward steel for existing. It rewards steel that arrives. By mid-morning, the German attack had not necessarily collapsed everywhere. Battles are messy. Some units may have found lanes. Some may have pushed through. Some Soviet positions may have been overrun despite the mines. But in the sectors where the system worked, the Germans found themselves paying heavily for every meter. And the strangest part was this. Not every mine had exploded. Some did not need to. By then, the suspicion of mines had begun doing its own work. The mathematics of delay. War is full of numbers that look small until they are placed beside a man's life. 3 minutes. 50 meters. 1 broken track. A dozen mines across a likely route. 1 anti-tank gun with a narrow angle. A single field telephone line still working after shellfire. None of these sounds decisive alone. They are not the numbers that fill victory speeches. They do not have the weight of divisions, armies, or front-wide offensives. But at the level where men live or die, small numbers can become enormous. A German tank column moving before dawn might depend on timing so tight that even a brief delay begins to damage the whole plan. Tanks must reach a position before Soviet artillery reacts. Infantry must be close enough to exploit the movement. Engineers must not be pinned down too early. Radio contact must hold. Adjacent units must not outrun or fall behind one another. The attack is not just movement. It is choreography under pressure. A minefield attacks choreography. It introduces a pause no one scheduled. The first tank stops. Perhaps the crew survives. Perhaps the vehicle is reparable. On a report written days later, it may not even count as permanently lost. But in the moment, none of that matters. It is in the way. The second vehicle slows. The third cannot see clearly. Infantry bunches. Engineers are called. Artillery begins to fall. 5 minutes pass. 5 minutes in a warm office is nothing. 5 minutes in a minefield under observation is a lifetime. In those 5 minutes, a Soviet observer can correct fire. A gun crew can shift its aim. A commander can realize the German axis of attack. A runner can carry orders when the telephone line fails. A reserve squad can move into a trench. A wounded man can bleed out. A German officer can lose the narrow window in which surprise still existed. What matters is not only how many tanks the mines destroyed. What matters is what the mines did to time. There is also the economy of it. A mine was cheap compared with a tank. It required far less industrial investment, less fuel, less training, less transport. It did not need a crew. It did not need spare parts once buried. It did not need to be brave at the moment of detonation. That does not make it noble. It makes it efficient. And war often rewards efficiency in ugly forms. A mine that damaged a track could immobilize a machine requiring a factory, a crew, ammunition, fuel, maintenance, recovery assets, and command attention. Even if the tank was later repaired, the mine had already extracted something valuable. Time, confidence, and coordination. The Germans knew this in theory. But knowing a truth in theory is different from feeling it through a stopped column. Consider the recovery problem. A damaged tank under fire cannot simply be lifted away like a broken cart. Someone has to reach it. A recovery vehicle or another tank may have to tow it. The ground may not support the maneuver. The towing vehicle may itself enter the minefield. Men may have to attach cables under fire, hands stiff, bodies exposed, while machine guns and artillery search the area. A single immobilized tank becomes a task. A task becomes a delay. A delay becomes a target. Multiply that across a front, and the numbers begin to change character. Reports from major Eastern Front defensive operations later showed how extensive Soviet mine warfare could become, especially in prepared defensive belts such as those seen around Kursk. Verify, but the emotional truth does not require exact totals to be understood. The logic was simple enough to be frightening. If the Germans had to check every route, they slowed. If they ignored the mines, they lost vehicles. If they stopped to clear them, they entered artillery time. If they bypassed, they might enter the lane the Soviets had chosen for them. That is not a wall. It is a tax on every decision. The minefield demanded payment whether it exploded or not. And this is where the psychological and mathematical sides joined. A mine that detonates destroys certainty in the immediate area. A mine that might exist destroys certainty everywhere nearby. After the first explosions, German commanders could no longer assume that open ground was open. Even clear patches had to be questioned. Even roads had to be checked. Even a rapid advance through an apparently empty field required nerve, because every driver knew the next meter might be the one selected by an enemy hand hours earlier. The cost of suspicion is difficult to measure. It does not always appear in tank loss tables. It appears in late arrivals, in unsupported infantry, in artillery fired at the wrong time, in commanders hesitating before committing reserves, in attacks that lose their edge before reaching the line. A minefield might damage 10 tanks, but if it makes 30 more slow down, spread out, bunch up, halt, reverse, or expose their flanks, its true effect is larger than the crater count. This was the mathematics of delay. Not clean, not always visible, but real. And for the Soviet defenders, delay was survival. Every minute stolen from a German armored attack was a minute in which the defense could become less surprised and more deliberate. Every stopped tank was a landmark. Every explosion was a signal. Every confused radio transmission from the enemy was a hint that the plan was no longer moving at the speed the planners had imagined. The Germans believed that mines were a physical obstacle. What really happened was that mines became a weapon against time itself. And once time turned against an attacking force, the cold began to feel colder. Engines burned fuel while going nowhere. Men in open positions lost feeling in their hands. Officers repeated orders that no longer matched the ground. The snow kept falling, covering tracks, craters, blood, and sometimes the mines that had not yet been found. By then, the field had done something no diagram could show. It had entered the minds of the men facing it. And from that moment forward, every white field ahead carried the same question. Is it empty, or is it waiting? Every white field became suspicious. Fear in armored warfare is not always loud. Sometimes it is a driver easing off the throttle without being ordered. Sometimes it is a commander staring too long at a patch of snow. Sometimes it is a radio message repeated because no one wants to be the first to move into uncertain ground. After the first minefield, the next field is never just a field. That was one of the cruelest effects of Soviet mine warfare. It did not remain where it was buried. It traveled forward in the imagination of the men who survived it. A German tank crew that had watched 2 vehicles lose tracks before dawn did not forget the sight by midday. They carried it with them. The blast, the sudden halt, the useless spinning of a drive sprocket, the pioneer crawling and then not moving, the artillery arriving as if it had been waiting for the exact sound. So when the next stretch of snow opened ahead, the crew looked differently. A shallow drift near the road was no longer just wind. A broken fence line suggested a possible marker. A patch of darker snow might mean disturbed earth. A clean path might be too clean. An abandoned Soviet crate might be bait or nothing, or both in the mind of a man with no time to decide. The battlefield had become interpretive. That is exhausting. Soldiers can endure danger. Many cannot endure endless uncertainty without it changing them. Visible danger gives the mind something to focus on. A gun flashes. A shell lands. A man fires. You react. Invisible danger forces the mind to search everything. Creates labor inside the skull. Every meter becomes a calculation made with incomplete information. German crews were not cowards for slowing down. They were human beings inside steel machines, trying to survive a form of danger that punished confidence and hesitation alike. Too fast and you hit the mine. Too slow and the artillery finds you. Stop and you become a target. Move and you may become wreckage. This was the trap beneath the trap. The Soviet defenders understood that real mines and suspected mines could work together. Dummy minefields, warning signs, disturbed ground, partial belts, and rumors could all influence movement. A commander who had lost vehicles to mines earlier in the morning could not simply dismiss the possibility later. Even if a field contained no mines, the memory of mines altered the approach. And memory has weight. Inside the tank, the men felt it physically. The driver watched the ground immediately ahead, though he could see little. The commander tried to scan wider, but every detail asked for attention. The gunner wanted targets, not snow. The radio operator listened to reports from other vehicles. Another mine? Possible mine? Lane unclear, pioneers delayed. The loader said nothing. He had no useful task until the gun fired, and waiting with no task is its own punishment. The engine heat did not remove the cold. It only made the air worse. Oil, sweat, metal, damp wool, cordite from previous firing, breath trapped inside armor. Men wiped condensation from optics and tried not to think about the bottom of the tank, the thin space between their boots and the ground that might erupt without warning. Outside, engineers moved with probes. Slowly. Too slowly for the officers behind them. Not slowly enough for the men doing the work. A probe touches ground. Push. Withdraw. Next spot. Push. Withdraw. Mark. Check again. The body must remain calm while every instinct wants to hurry. A man clearing mines under fire is forced to make patience visible in a place where impatience is being shouted at him through radios, gestures, and exploding shells. Some minefields were real. Some were incomplete. Some had been laid hastily and badly. Some were deadly. Some had gaps. Some were covered by fire. Some were not. The problem was that the Germans often could not know which kind they faced until they paid to find out. And the payment was usually made by the first vehicle forward. This uncertainty affected commanders as well. A German officer trained to maintain momentum now had to decide whether caution was wisdom or weakness. If he delayed and the attack failed, he might be blamed for timidity. If he pushed and lost vehicles, he might be blamed for recklessness. The minefield offered no clean moral ground. It turned command into a series of compromised choices. War often does that. It leaves men choosing between errors, then judges them afterward as if they had been choosing between clarity and confusion. The Soviets were not immune to this. Their own minefields could endanger their own troops if maps were lost or lines shifted. A retreat through poorly marked obstacles could become chaos. Civilians and soldiers alike could suffer later from mines that remained after the tactical moment had passed. Mine warfare carries a long shadow. But during the fighting, in that frozen hour, the immediate effect was undeniable. German tanks that had been built to advance across ground began to distrust ground itself. That distrust spread. It reached the infantry following behind the armor. Men stepped where others had stepped, then wondered if repeated footsteps meant safety or simply luck. It reached the engineers, who knew the enemy sometimes protected anti-tank mines with smaller devices meant for the men sent to clear them. It reached the officers, who watched planned movement become cautious probing. It reached the radio net, where every uncertain report multiplied unease. The Germans believed the Soviet minefield was beneath them. What really happened was that it got inside them. By afternoon, the snowfield was no longer just terrain. It had become a memory of explosions waiting to repeat. And in war, memory can be as real as steel. It changes posture. It changes breathing. It changes the pressure of a hand on a throttle. Somewhere ahead, another white field waited. Maybe it was empty. Maybe it was not. That uncertainty was now part of the Soviet defense. And it meant that the next men ordered forward would not be the tank commanders. They would be the men with probes, cables, and shaking hands. The men who crawled forward. When tanks stop, men have to leave them. That is one of the plainest and most brutal truths of armored war. The machine can carry men into danger, shield them from fragments, give them a gun larger than anything they could carry, and make them feel, for a while, like the battlefield can be forced open by engine power. But when the track breaks, when the road is blocked, when the minefield has to be cleared, the war shrinks again. It becomes a man on his stomach in the snow. A German pioneer crawls forward with a probe in one hand and his body pressed low enough that his elbows sink through the crust. He can hear engines behind him, impatient and helpless. He can hear shells landing somewhere to his right. He can hear the strange snapping sound bullets make when they pass close in cold air. He is not thinking about doctrine. He is thinking about the next patch of snow. The work is intimate. A probe into the ground. A pause. A careful pressure. Not too hard. Not careless. He must feel for resistance. But the frozen soil lies to the hand. Stones, roots, metal fragments, ice, shell splinters, pieces of old wire. The battlefield is full of things that are not mines but feel like warnings. And some warnings are real. Behind him, a disabled tank blocks the route. His crew may still be inside. Perhaps they are shouting for a tow. Perhaps one man is wounded. Perhaps they are silent because the radio is out, or because smoke has filled the compartment, or because they understand that opening the hatch might draw fire. A cable team is ordered forward. Cables are heavy when dry. In snow, under fire, with gloves stiff and fingers numb, they become stubborn things. A man has to reach the towing point. He has to attach the hook. He has to do it while crouched beside a tank that enemy gunners have already ranged. The tank's armor protects the crew inside better than it protects the man outside. He knows this. He moves anyway because the road cannot remain blocked. This is where the cost of the minefield becomes human. Not in theory, in posture, crawling, kneeling, dragging, freezing, waiting for the next shot to choose someone. On the Soviet side, the sappers paid too. Their work was not finished after the mines were laid. If Germans opened a lane, Soviet engineers might be ordered to close it again at night. If a mine belt was damaged by shellfire, someone had to repair or reinforce it. If Soviet infantry counterattacked, someone had to know where the safe gaps were. If the line shifted, the buried defense could become a threat to the men who had built it. Mines do not love the side that plants them. They obey pressure, not flags. That is why the men who worked with them carried a special kind of burden. They had to remember what the ground concealed. They had to trust maps that could be lost. They had to mark lanes in ways that friendly troops could understand but enemy troops would miss. They had to live with the knowledge that a mistake might kill someone hours, days, or years later. The documentary image of war often prefers decisive moments. A tank fires. Plane dives. A flag rises. But much of war is men doing necessary work no one wants to do and no camera can make clean. A medic tries to reach a wounded man near the edge of the minefield and is told to wait. Wait for engineers. Wait for smoke. Wait for darkness. The wounded man cannot wait. So the medic weighs one life against the ground. He may crawl anyway. He may not. Neither choice leaves him untouched. A German infantryman sees a comrade lying in a shallow depression and cannot tell whether the route to him is mined. He calls out. No answer. He steps forward, then stops because another soldier grabs his coat. For the rest of his life, if he survives, he may remember that hand on his collar more clearly than the battle. A Soviet sapper, watching from a forward position, sees German engineers moving through the belt he helped lay. He knows they are enemies. He also knows exactly what kind of fear they are feeling because he has felt it himself only hours earlier when placing the mines under German observation. War creates these mirrored moments. Men trained to kill one another recognize each other's terror without forgiving anything. The minefield does not care. It lies between them, patient and impartial. Reports later may say that the German attack was delayed, that several tanks were immobilized, that engineer troops suffered casualties, that Soviet defensive fire was effective. All true, perhaps, but the language is too smooth for what happened there. No report can fully hold the sound of a man breathing through wool while probing for a mine. No map can show the shame of being afraid to take one step, even when that fear is reasonable. No loss table can measure what it does to a tank crew to sit inside armor, unable to move, listening to men outside die trying to save the vehicle. The Germans believed mines were crude. What really happened was that crude weapons forced modern soldiers into ancient fear, the fear of the next footstep. And by the time the field was partly cleared, the attack had changed. It might continue, but not with the same confidence. It might reach the ridge, but not on the same schedule. It might report success, but the men who crossed the field would remember the price hidden inside that word. Afterward, officers would write. They would need explanations. They would count tanks, mines, lanes, casualties, delays. And in those reports, the minefield would finally receive a kind of recognition. But the men who built it, crossed it, and bled inside it would not all fit into the lines. Reports written too late. After the battle, the language changed. It always does. Smoke clears. Engines cool. Wounded men are carried away if they can be reached. Snow begins to cover the black marks around shell bursts. The battlefield, which had been noise and pressure and immediate fear, becomes something else in the hands of staff officers. It becomes a report. The report has headings. Enemy resistance. Mine obstacles. Tank losses. Engineer action. Artillery fire. Progress achieved. Progress delayed. There is a kind of mercy in this language. It allows armies to continue. No military organization can function if every report is written with the full emotional weight of what men saw. But there is also a kind of betrayal in it. The words become clean where the ground was not. A German officer might write that Soviet minefields were extensive, well concealed, or covered by fire. He might note that armored movement was delayed, that pioneer units were required, that bypass attempts led to additional losses. Somewhere in the phrasing, a shift occurs. The mines are no longer dismissed as crude clutter. They are recognized as integrated obstacles. The recognition is late. It often arrives after the tracks have already broken. On the Soviet side, the paperwork has its own restraint. Engineer units may be praised for preparing defensive belts. A sapper platoon may be mentioned. Commander may recommend decorations. The language may speak of courage, discipline, successful obstacle construction, enemy tanks disabled. But even praise can flatten a man. Who was the sapper who placed the mine that stopped the lead tank? Who chose the false gap? Who marked the safe lane for Soviet infantry and then had to guide men through it under shellfire? Who froze his hands so badly that he could not button his coat afterward? Some names survived. Many did not. The Eastern Front was too large, too violent, too hungry for individuals. It consumed stories faster than anyone could write them down. Men became numbers not because they were unimportant, but because the scale of the war made memory itself struggle. Still, the lesson spread. German units became more cautious around Soviet obstacles. Engineer reconnaissance gained urgency. Mine clearing, lane marking, and coordination with armor became matters of survival. Commanders who had once thought of mines as delays had to account for them as systems. Soviet defensive belts, especially in major prepared operations, showed how mines could multiply the power of other weapons. Verify. The minefield's reputation changed because men at the front forced it to change. Not through speeches, through wreckage, through halted attacks, through reports that admitted line by line that something cheap, hidden, and patient had interfered with machines built for movement. There is a temptation to make this lesson too neat. To say the Germans were arrogant and the Soviets were clever and leave it there. But war is rarely that tidy. German engineers were skilled. German tank crews were often experienced and brave. Soviet minefields could be poorly laid, dangerous to friendly troops, or overwhelmed by determined attacks. Mines were not magic. They did not replace artillery, infantry, armor, or command, but they changed the terms. That is the important thing. They forced armored warfare to admit its dependence on ground. A tank looks independent. It carries its weapon, its crew, its armor, its engine. It seems to bring its own world with it. But a tank still needs traction. It needs space. It needs routes. It needs bridges that hold, roads not blocked, fields not seeded with explosives. It needs men outside the tank doing work the tank cannot do for itself. The minefield exposed that dependence. And it exposed something else, the limits of belief. The Germans believed that speed could solve many battlefield problems. Often it could. But speed depends on trust. Trust in the map. Trust in reconnaissance. Trust in the ground. Trust that the route ahead is dangerous only in visible ways. Soviet minefields attacked that trust. Once that lesson appeared in reports, it could be studied. But the first men to learn it did not learn from reports. They learned from the sound under the track. From the sudden tilt of the hull. From the silence after the explosion when everyone waited to know who was alive. Official recognition always arrives speaking in past tense. The minefield had already done its work. The tanks had already stopped. The engineers had already crawled. The wounded had already waited. And the snow had already covered much of the evidence. Years later, historians would discuss doctrine, production, defensive belts, operational art. Those things matter. They help us understand how armies fought at scale. But if we only look there, we miss the small human hinge on which the larger machine turned. A sapper with a shovel. A driver with his hands on the levers. Pioneer with a probe. A commander realizing the field on his map was not the field beneath his tracks. The reports preserved the lesson. But the lesson was paid for before it was written. And its legacy reached beyond that winter field, beyond one attack, beyond one set of disabled tanks. It entered the way armies thought about movement itself. The ground remembered. By evening, the field looked quieter than it had any right to look. That is one of war's strange cruelties. A place can hold terror for hours, then return to stillness as if nothing extraordinary happened there. Snow falls again. Smoke thins. The wind moves loose powder across craters and track marks. A broken vehicle becomes a dark shape, then a softer shape, then part of the landscape. But the ground remembers in ways men do not always see. Under the snow, some minds may remain. Some have done their work. Some have failed. Some are waiting for a pressure that may come from a soldier, a horse, a recovery crew, or a farmer long after the battle has moved away. The tactical moment passes. The danger does not always pass with it. That is why mine warfare cannot be romanticized. It is effective. It is also cruel. Both truths have to stand together. The Soviet minefields that stopped German tanks in the snow were not clean instruments of genius. They were desperate, practical, dangerous tools used by an army fighting for survival on a front where mistakes were paid for in villages, divisions, and lives. The men who laid them were often ordinary soldiers under extraordinary pressure. They were not mythical figures. They were cold, frightened, skilled, exhausted, and necessary. The German crews who entered those fields were not cartoon villains mocked by fate. They were men inside machines, trained to move, ordered to attack, and forced to discover that the ground beneath them had been turned into an enemy. Some had believed the mines were crude. Some had respected them already. Some had no time to think anything before the blast came. War does not distribute understanding fairly. Often, the truth arrives first to the man with the least power to change anything. The driver feels the explosion before the general reads the report. The pioneer sees the mine before the staff officer updates the map. The wounded infantryman understands the delay before headquarters calculates it. The sapper knows the field before history names the operation. That is why this story belongs not only to tanks, but to the men around and beneath them, the engineers, the artillery observers, the infantrymen waiting in trenches, the crews trapped inside disabled vehicles, the medics held back by invisible danger, the junior officers whose decisions disappeared into phrases like obstacle preparation and delayed enemy armor. The Germans believed Soviet minefields were crude obstacles that could be cleared, bypassed, or overcome by discipline and speed. But what really happened was that those minefields became weapons of time. They stole minutes. They broke rhythm. They turned open ground into a question. They made tanks stop where guns could reach them. They made commanders hesitate. They made every white field ahead feel alive with hidden intention. And sometimes that was enough. Not every tank burned. Not every crew died. Not every mine exploded. But the attack changed. The plan changed. The confidence changed. Steel that had been built to move found itself waiting in the snow, while men outside crawled forward with probes and cables, trying to negotiate with the ground. Return to 417. The watch in the turret. The frost on the glass. The engine vibration rising through the floor. The lead tank moving into a field that looked empty. For the German commander, the danger seemed to be ahead, in the Soviet line, in the trees, in the guns that had not yet fired. For the Soviet sapper, the danger had already been placed exactly where it needed to be. That was the collision. Belief against reality. Movement against preparation. Steel against snow-covered patience. They believed the machine would decide the ground. But what really happened was that the ground, shaped by unseen hands, decided what the machine could become. Not invincible. Not useless. Just stopped. And in war, sometimes stopped is enough. If you watch this story to the end, let us know where you are watching from. And if someone in your family served in the war, in any uniform, on any front, in any role remembered or forgotten, you are welcome to share their story in the comments. Warfront Archive is built for these quieter histories, the moments beneath the famous battles, where belief met reality and ordinary men carried the weight of decisions made far above them. Subscribe to Warfront Archive for more World War II documentaries about what they believed and what really happened.